On my 68th birthday, I arrived at my son's brand new home with a warm casserole dish in one hand and a handmade gift in the other, thinking, foolishly, perhaps, that he might pause, look me in the eye, and say something like, "Happy birthday, Mom. I'm glad you're here." Instead, I was ushered in like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome before she even sat down. And by the time he said the words, "Let's not start a story, just eat," I realized I wasn't a mother in that room anymore. I was background noise, a muted television in a silent house. And that's the moment this revenge story really began. Not with yelling or tears, but with silence and the quiet click of a front door that never opened for me again. Deet. Nancy Elridge stepped carefully over the threshold of her son's Charleston home, her knees aching slightly from the flight, though she didn't dare show it. The house smelled like linen spray and rosemary focaccia. Not a trace of the banana bread scent that used to fill their old kitchen back in Raleigh. She clutched the Tupperware dish tighter, the one she'd brought from home. Her signature squash casserole resting warm inside. She'd written the recipe out on a floral index card, just in case Emily, her daughter-in-law, ever wanted to try it sometime. The card was taped to the lid with a gentle optimism she'd regret later. The foyer was pristine, too pristine, not a shoe out of place, not a coat slung over the staircase railing. The silence was tight, well managed. The kind you found in luxury car commercials. Caleb appeared at the top of the stairs, blazer half on, phone still pressed to his ear. "Yeah, no, I'll call you back." "Yeah, she just walked in." His voice flattened as his eyes met hers. Not warm, not cold, just efficient. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said. No hug, no smile, no rush down the stairs. Emily glided in from the kitchen, wine glass in hand, a manicured smile already in place. "We've got a full house tonight. Nancy, go ahead and set your dish on the sideboard." "Okay." "Caleb's got a bunch of people coming from his firm." Nancy smiled politely and did as she was told. The dining room was set with gold chargers and crystal stemware that looked like it had never touched a dishwasher. At the far end of the table sat a cake, store-bought, white frosting, no candles. It wasn't hers. A younger woman, one of Emily's Pilates friends perhaps, wandered by and said, "Oh, are you Caleb's mom? You look just like him. Except, softer." Nancy laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was safer than silence. The evening moved quickly. Too quickly. She found herself seated at the far corner of the long table, between a financial advisor named Nick and someone's girlfriend who only talked about intermittent fasting. Caleb sat near the head, holding court, tossing business terms like equity laddering and compound liquidity as if they were casual appetizers. Not once did he look in her direction. Nancy took a bite of the arugula salad, which tasted like regret, and glanced down the table. She tried to jump in gently when there was a lull in conversation. Caleb used to hate arugula," she said with a soft chuckle. "Until one summer, remember the garden? Honey, you ate so many salads I thought you'd turn green." Caleb didn't look up. He just raised his glass and said, flatly, "Let's not start a story. Mom, just eat." The sentence landed sharper than he intended, or maybe exactly how he intended. Either way, forks paused. Eyes looked anywhere but at her. Even the candles seemed to flicker lower. Nancy nodded once, kept chewing, and did not try again. When dinner ended, the guests migrated to the living room for bourbon and laughter. Nancy stayed behind, slowly clearing plates that weren't hers. Eliza, her 17-year-old granddaughter, re-entered the room to grab her phone and hesitated. "You okay?" "Grandma," Nancy smiled. Genuinely this time. "I'm just giving the forks a little help getting back to their drawers." Eliza lingered. "That story about the garden, was it real?" "Very," Nancy said, her voice quiet. Eliza nodded, and her fingers brushed the recipe card still taped to the casserole lid. "Can I keep this?" Nancy blinked. Of course. Later that night, back in her small hotel room with one working lamp and a window that faced a brick wall, Nancy opened her laptop and began typing. She didn't begin with emotion. She began with numbers. Her financial advisor had confirmed the total recently, $640,000 spread across her Asheville condo, a retirement fund, and the old mutual investments David, her late husband, had left behind. She typed slowly, deliberately. I would like to amend the beneficiary of my estate, remove Caleb Elridge from all primary designations, reassign full disbursement to Eliza Elridge, to be held in trust until her 21st birthday. She reread the sentence once, twice, then added, include sealed letter of explanation, release only upon my passing. Nancy closed the laptop and exhaled. The kind of breath you take when you realize you've been holding it in for 20 years. This time, she wasn't going to fight for a seat at the table. She was going to build her own, one that couldn't be erased, one that Eliza might sit at someday and remember the woman who once told a story when no one else was listening. Nancy didn't expect a marching band. She didn't need candles or a toast or some slideshow set to nostalgic piano music. But what she hoped for, quietly, deep down, was that her son might reach for her hand during dinner, or that someone might say, you know, Caleb wouldn't be here without you. Instead, she sat 2 chairs down from the nearest warmth, surrounded by faces she didn't know, in a house her own hands had helped build, though no one seemed to remember that part. The dining table stretched too long, like a metaphor that didn't know when to end. 12 guests, 1 centerpiece made of dried hydrangeas, 3 side dishes catered from a place with artisan in the name. At the far end, Caleb raised his glass and said, to new chapters and good company. Not to her, not once. Nancy smiled. A smile people wear when they realize they've been demoted to supporting cast in someone else's life story. Emily leaned toward a guest from Caleb's firm and said, we just love Charleston. We were finally able to upgrade Mom into a place closer to us, so it's easier to check in. Nancy blinked. Upgrade was a word used for flights or laptops, not mothers. No one corrected her. She shifted in her chair, the fabric catching on her dress. Her casserole dish sat cold on the kitchen counter, untouched. The recipe card taped on top looked limp now, curling at the corners. Next to it stood a towering bottle of Chianti someone else had brought, already opened. She recognized its label. It cost $82 a bottle. The wine she'd brought, a simple bottle from her favorite North Carolina vineyard, still sat unopened. Like her, Eliza, she whispered. As her granddaughter passed behind her chair, the girl leaned down slightly. Yes, Grandma. Nancy's voice was low, but firm. Would you do me a kindness? Sweetheart, put the wine I brought in the fridge. I don't want it to go bad. Eliza nodded, and Nancy caught the quick glance she gave her father before walking off. Eliza knew, children always did, when something wasn't quite right. As dessert rolled around, someone lit a candle on a lemon tart, not a cake, not her favorite, not even a note acknowledging the occasion. The candle flickered against the dimmed lights, and someone joked, let's not burn down the new chandelier. Laughter echoed around the room. Nancy's hand stayed folded in her lap. Emily stood and clinked her glass. Just a quick thank you for being here tonight. Caleb's worked hard to build this new chapter in our lives, and we're grateful to share it with the people who really support him. Nancy's breath caught just a moment. The people who really support him. She didn't speak, didn't ask for her turn. She wasn't sure she had one. The silence that followed felt loud in her bones. Someone asked about the new espresso machine. Someone else praised the tile work in the foyer. Nancy kept her back straight, her jaw steady. She had trained for this moment her entire life, being silent so others could shine. As the guests moved toward the living room, Caleb came over and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. You doing okay? Mom. She looked up at him and smiled again. It didn't touch her eyes. Of course, just enjoying the view. He didn't ask what she meant. He never did. Later, Nancy stood by the kitchen sink, washing dishes no one had asked her to clean. The water was hot. Her hands moved methodically. Eliza entered again, this time quieter. I saved you a slice of tart, she said, holding out a paper plate. Nancy looked at it. Thank you, honey. That was kind. They stood together in the kitchen for a long moment, the quiet hum of the dishwasher pulsing behind them. You know, Nancy said gently, eyes still on the suds. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from being erased so slowly you don't even notice until there's nothing left of you in the room. Eliza didn't speak, but her eyes filled. Nancy turned off the tap and looked at her granddaughter directly. If you ever feel that way, like your voice doesn't matter, I hope you remember this. You can always write yourself back in. To viewers out there, have you ever been in a room full of people, but felt completely unseen? Like you'd become part of the furniture or a painting on the wall no one looks at anymore. If that's ever happened to you, you're not alone. And maybe, like Nancy, it's time to reclaim your name in the story. That night, alone in her hotel bed, Nancy opened the small leather journal she kept tucked in her purse. It was a birthday gift from David, her late husband, back when gifts meant something, and birthdays meant celebration. She wrote, "Tonight, my son toasted to new beginnings. He just didn't know mine had already started." She closed the book, turned off the lamp, and stared into the dark where no one was asking her to be smaller anymore. The clink of cutlery and clatter of dishes filled the Charleston kitchen long after the guests had gone home. Caleb had disappeared upstairs with Emily. Eliza had offered to stay and help clean up, but Nancy had waved her off. "You should rest," she said gently. "It's your weekend, too." The girl hesitated, then leaned in and kissed Nancy's cheek before heading to bed. That kiss lingered longer than the candlelight. Nancy stood barefoot on the cool tile, rinsing the last of the wine glasses that had never poured from her bottle. The one she brought still sat unopened on the counter, its label curling at the edges where the condensation had dried. She reached for it, held it for a moment, then gently placed it in the fridge, quietly, deliberately, as if still trying not to disturb anyone. Her casserole dish had been moved, untouched, to the far edge of the counter behind a blender and a stack of takeout containers. The recipe card she'd taped so carefully had fallen behind the knife block. She didn't bother retrieving it. She glanced down at the paper plate Eliza had brought her earlier, the slice of lemon tart now limp and wilted. It looked exhausted, just like her. Nancy pulled out a bar stool and sat down at the kitchen island. Her purse rested at her feet. She didn't open it, didn't reach for her phone. There was no one she needed to call, no one expecting her voice. Across the room, framed family photos lined a floating shelf above the fireplace. Caleb's wedding, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for his company, the children in Halloween costumes, even a snapshot from their recent trip to Jackson Hole. Nancy wasn't in a single one. She remembered taking several of those pictures, holding coats, pouring hot cocoa, adjusting her grandson's tie. She had been there. She just hadn't been seen. Nancy folded her hands in her lap. The silence was so complete it felt padded, as if the house itself were trying to mute her grief before it spilled too loud into the walls. She thought about leaving a note, something simple. "Thank you for dinner. The tart was lovely. I won't forget it." But she didn't write it. Instead, she stood, walked to the front door, and stepped outside into the crisp night air. Charleston's sky was clear, stars blinking faintly above the tall palms lining the street. The wind pulled softly at her coat. She walked to her rental car, opened the driver's side door, and sat for a moment without turning on the engine. She wasn't sad, not exactly, not in the way people cry into tissues and clutch their chest. It was quieter than that, like a click inside her, a latch slipping into place, a realization she wasn't needed anymore, not by her son. Not in this house. Not in the version of the family that lived in the photographs she hadn't been invited into. She pulled out her phone and opened her contacts. David's name was still saved there. Her late husband. She tapped it. The phone didn't dial. Of course not. But she stared at it for a while. Then, slowly, she scrolled to another name. Joan Elridge, estate attorney. She didn't call. Not yet. But she pressed her finger on the screen and selected Add to Favorites. It was the first favor she'd granted herself in years. The next morning, she checked out of the hotel without eating breakfast. The front desk clerk handed her a receipt and said, "Hope you had a special birthday." Nancy smiled. "I did." She drove the long way home, avoided the highway, took the coastal route instead. windows cracked just enough to let in the salt air. Her mind wandered to music, to a piece she once composed during her second year of teaching, a lullaby with no lyrics, just chords that drifted like sea glass. She hadn't played it in years, but it came back to her now. The tempo, the key, even the final note. Back in her apartment in Asheville, the house was as she'd left it, quiet. But this time, the quiet didn't hurt. It felt earned. She opened her bedroom closet and pulled out a metal filing box. Inside, her marriage certificate, old report cards from when Caleb was in second grade, and a faded envelope labeled Estate Original Copy. She added a fresh folder beside it and labeled it in pen, Revision, not final. She wasn't rushing, but she was ready. She sat down at her writing desk and took out a fresh sheet of paper, the first draft of a letter, not to Caleb, but to Eliza, the girl who had seen her, who had saved her a slice of tart when no one else even remembered the day. Dear Eliza, if one day you ever wonder why things were left to you, this is your answer. Because you asked how I was doing. Because you listened. She didn't finish the letter yet. That would come later. But the beginning was enough. Nancy walked into her kitchen, brewed a cup of herbal tea, and sat at her small table. The one where David used to do crossword puzzles on Sunday mornings. The one where she had once told Caleb, every good story needs someone who knows when to listen. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. So did her resolve. This wasn't the end of anything. It was just the moment she stopped asking to be remembered and started choosing who to be remembered by. The Tuesday after her birthday. Nancy stood in front of the mirrored closet door in her Asheville apartment and buttoned up her favorite navy cardigan. It was threadbare at the sleeves and a little tight across the shoulders, but she'd worn it during David's retirement ceremony and refused to part with it. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and gave her reflection a look that was neither proud nor ashamed, just precise. She reached into the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a yellow sticky note she'd written the night before. Wednesday, 11:00 Joan, bring everything. Joan Elridge had been her estate attorney for nearly 2 decades. She'd handled the probate after David passed, helped Nancy set up the original trust, and sent her Christmas cards that always had a handwritten message in blue ink. She was kind, thorough, and discreet. Nancy slid the sticky note into her purse and added the 2 envelopes she'd prepared, one containing her current will, and one blank, labeled in pencil. New draft, confidential. Then she took one last sip of her coffee, grabbed her keys, and locked the door behind her. The drive to Joan's office took 30 minutes. The route was familiar, down the winding stretch of I-26, past the overlook where David used to pull over just to breathe mountain air, like it cost something. Nancy had once found that silly. Now she missed the ritual. Joan's office sat on the second floor of a law building that smelled faintly of lemon polish and ink. Nancy didn't need directions. She'd been here for so many milestones, most of which had gone uncelebrated by anyone except her. Joan stood to greet her, glasses perched on her head, expression as composed as ever. "You're early," she said, reaching for a legal pad. That usually means something's changed. Nancy gave a tight smile. It has. They sat in matching leather chairs across a polished walnut desk. Nancy placed the 2 envelopes between them. "I want to revise the trust," she said. "Effective immediately." Joan paused, pen hovering. "What kind of revision?" Nancy took a breath. "I want Caleb removed from everything." There it was. The words had weight, like wet laundry. She didn't flinch, didn't stammer. She simply placed the weight on the table and waited for Joan to pick it up. Joan leaned back in her chair and studied her. "All right," she said, slowly. "Just to confirm, the Asheville condo, the retirement fund, the brokerage accounts, he's off all of it." "All of it," Nancy said, her voice low but unwavering. Joan nodded and flipped to a fresh page. "Do you have alternate beneficiaries in mind?" "Eliza," Nancy said, "my granddaughter, but not right away. I want it held in trust until she turns 21. No early access, no exceptions." Joan raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "And I want to include a letter," Nancy added, "a personal one, to be released to her after my passing. I'll write it myself. I've already started. Joan scribbled a few notes. Do you want Caleb to receive any kind of notification? No, Nancy said quickly. I want him to find out the way he found out about my birthday. As an afterthought, Joan blinked, then let out a small breath. Maybe not a laugh, but something adjacent to it. You're sure about this? Nancy nodded. I've spent a lifetime waiting to be seen. I'm done. She sat back in her chair and felt something unfamiliar. Stillness. Not the anxious kind that filled a room when someone forgets your name. No, this was the kind that settles in your bones when you finally made peace with not chasing anything anymore. Joan began typing. The quiet rhythm of the keyboard filled the space between them. Nancy glanced around the office, the bookshelf lined with binders, the framed diploma on the wall, the small photograph of Joan and her wife at the Grand Canyon. She didn't envy Joan's life. She just admired that someone, somewhere, had chosen her and remembered to take a picture. When the draft was complete, Joan slid it across the desk. Nancy read every line, carefully. When she reached the clause that read revocation of primary beneficiary, Caleb Elridge, she didn't pause. She didn't tremble. She just signed. Joan collected the pages, clipped them into a leather folder, and said, once this is filed, it's locked. He won't be able to contest it, even posthumously. Good, Nancy said. Let it be clean. Joan looked up. You're not doing this to hurt him. I know, Nancy replied. That's why it'll work. She rose, shook Joan's hand, and left the building with her shoulders squared. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk. Nancy looked up at the sky, the sun blinking through thin clouds, and whispered quietly, not to anyone. Really, but maybe to David, wherever he was. You always said I was too soft. I just hadn't learned how to say no with a signature yet. She got into her car, placed the updated documents in the glove box, and pulled out into traffic. There was no music on the drive home, no calls, no distractions. Just the quiet satisfaction of doing something not out of anger, but clarity. Nancy didn't throw anything out. She didn't storm through the house, flinging old photos into a trash bag or deleting Caleb's name from her phone. That wasn't how this part would go. No, this part required care, precision, thoughtfulness. Not because she was sentimental, but because she finally understood the power of removing someone properly, not out of rage, but out of resolve. It started with the photo albums, not the big leather-bound one with gold embossing that lived on the coffee table. She left that where it was. No one visited often enough to flip through it anyway. She began instead with the drawer beneath her writing desk, the one filled with old snapshots, the in-between moments, birthday breakfasts, science fair ribbons, blurry vacations, and Sunday dinners where Caleb was still learning to smile for the camera. She sat cross-legged on the carpet, sunlight slanting across the floor. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak in the ceiling above her. She moved slowly, intentionally, one photo at a time. In each, she examined Caleb's face, how he grinned, how he slouched, how he sometimes didn't look at her at all. And then she looked at her own. Her expressions varied, but they shared a thread, always smiling, always looking toward her son, as if waiting for him to look back. She kept some photos, tucked them into a separate envelope labeled, "For Eliza, if she ever asks." The rest, she didn't tear or burn. She simply removed them from their sleeves and placed them into a box she sealed with masking tape. No dramatics, just space reclaimed. Next came the recipes. Nancy had dozens, handwritten, smudged, annotated in pencil with notes like, David prefers less salt, or Caleb liked this before college. She pulled out the ones Caleb had grown up on and, without ceremony, clipped them together with a silver binder clip. Then she slipped them into a folder marked Archive and stored them in a plastic bin at the top of the hallway closet. The space that remained in the recipe box felt like breathing room. She took her time with the piano bench. It still held sheet music from decades past, her students' recital pieces, David's favorite lullabies, and a few compositions of her own. Nancy pulled out a manila folder labeled Caleb Early Pieces. She paused only once, running her fingers over a crayon-drawn staff paper titled Mom's Song. He'd written it at age 7, Notes scattered and out of key. But earnest. She didn't throw that one away either. She slipped it into the same envelope marked for Eliza and closed the lid of the bench. That night, she made dinner for herself, just herself, for the first time in months. A small roast chicken, rosemary potatoes, and sautéed kale. Nothing fancy. But she set the table with her good plates, the ones she used to bring out when guests came over. She poured a glass of wine from the bottle that had returned with her from Charleston, the one no one had opened. She toasted the quiet, not as loneliness, but as liberation. It had taken her nearly 70 years to learn the difference. In the weeks that followed, Nancy began withdrawing, gently, from the circles she'd once orbited out of obligation. She canceled the book club whose conversations had long turned shallow. She passed on the church volunteer list and politely declined Emily's forwarded email about a family Zoom call. She didn't send a long explanation. No guilt-soaked message. Just, thank you, but I'll be sitting this one out. Her phone buzzed with the occasional text from Caleb. Mom, everything okay? Haven't heard from you. Just checking in. Emily said you seem distant lately. Nancy read each one carefully and answered none of them. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. The final shift came one morning while dusting. She reached for the family portrait above the fireplace. Caleb, Emily, the grandkids, and herself in the corner, shoulder barely visible, face turned toward the baby. It wasn't a bad photo. It was just dishonest. She took it down. In its place, she hung a framed print Eliza had gifted her the Christmas before last. It was a sketch of a grand piano surrounded by wildflowers, with a handwritten quote beneath it. Some voices don't need microphones to be heard. Nancy stepped back and looked at it for a long moment, then nodded to no one in particular. She wasn't invisible. Not anymore. She hadn't erased Caleb. She'd simply stopped archiving him. That's a different thing entirely. Erasure is emotional violence. This was emotional stewardship. A quiet audit of space and attention. She mailed one package, not to Caleb, but to Eliza. Inside, the original recipe card from the casserole, a copy of her first lullaby sheet music, and a note that read, "For your ears only. When you're ready, I'll tell you the rest." The rest could wait. That evening, Nancy sat by her window with a warm mug of peppermint tea and no background noise. She didn't check her phone, didn't scroll, didn't hope for an invitation. She just let the silence stretch long across the hardwood floor, the way light used to fall when David played piano in the early evenings. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt earned. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the birthday dinner. No follow-up call from Caleb. No thank you text. Not even a mention of the wine she'd left behind. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was hollow, like an attic long since emptied, but still locked out of habit. Nancy wasn't surprised, but she was done hoping it would feel different. She spent her mornings at the library now, not to check out books, but to sit near the back, in a corner where the sun hit the table just right. She brought a notebook, not a journal, not something dramatic, just a ruled, navy blue pad where she wrote down moments she used to want to tell Caleb. Saw a girl today who looked just like Eliza. She was reading Steinbeck. The dogwood tree on Beechwood finally bloomed. Dad would have smiled. She didn't write them for him anymore. She wrote them so she could stop forgetting herself. One afternoon, while browsing the music section, she heard the hesitant tapping of shoes behind her. "Excuse me," said a voice, polite, unsure. She turned to find a young woman, maybe 21, holding a copy of The Joy of First Piano Lessons. "Sorry to bother you," the girl continued, "but I overheard you humming earlier. You used to teach music, didn't you?" Nancy smiled. "Yes, for a long time." The girl blushed. "Would you ever consider giving lessons again?" "My daughter's only 7, but I want her to start. I can't really afford a studio." Nancy didn't answer right away. She looked down at the dog-eared book in the girl's hands, then back into her hopeful eyes. It wasn't just about music. It was about wanting to give a child something beautiful. "I would love to," Nancy said, "and we'll figure something out. Don't worry about cost." The woman's shoulders dropped. "Just slightly. That's what relief looks like when someone's trying not to show desperation." They exchanged names, numbers. The girl's name was Mariah. Her daughter's was Joy. Later that day, Nancy wrote the names carefully in her notebook. Underneath, she wrote, "Some people may never ask for your story. Others will carry it forward just by asking a single question." At home, she received another message from Caleb. "Are you mad about something?" She didn't answer. She didn't delete it either. She simply turned the phone face down and left it on the kitchen counter, like a vase with no water. Because the truth is, some questions don't deserve answers. To those of you watching, have you ever reached a point where someone asks, "Are you mad?" but they never asked what happened to make you feel unseen in the first place? Sometimes the pain isn't about anger. It's about the fact they never cared enough to notice until your silence became inconvenient. That evening, Nancy pulled down a box from the top of her closet. Inside were mementos she'd once set aside for Caleb's children. A vintage brooch from her mother, a stack of tea towels embroidered with the family's initials, an old clay ornament Caleb had made in second grade, a snowman with a red scarf and lopsided smile. She held it in her palm for a long time, then she set it aside. She packed the rest, carefully, gently, into a new box labeled, "To be donated, Asheville Women's Shelter." The next morning, she delivered it herself. No announcement. No fanfare. Just a quiet knock on the office door and a soft-spoken, "These might bring someone comfort." The volunteer who received it smiled warmly. "They will!" "Thank you." That night, Nancy lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, tracing the familiar cracks she'd memorized years ago. She thought about all the times she'd been asked to not start a story. How many moments had been swallowed? How many things she'd buried behind a polite nod and a faint smile? She turned to her side and whispered into the dark. "You stopped calling me Mom long before I stopped answering to it." And it was true. Caleb hadn't really said Mom with warmth in years. The word had become functional, like an auto-filled title, a placeholder. She had become a contact in his phone, a holiday name in a text thread, a person to inform, not involve. She was no longer Mom, but she was still Nancy. And Nancy had more left to give than any of them had bothered to ask about. In the following days, she began writing more intentionally, not diary entries, but letters to Eliza, to Joy, to no one in particular. Pieces of herself she wanted to leave behind in case anyone cared to listen once she was gone. Not out of bitterness, but out of truth. Because silence shouldn't be the only inheritance women like her leave behind. And for the first time in a long while, Nancy allowed herself a smile that didn't have to mean anything to anyone else. It just belonged to her. It was a Tuesday when the family group chat came alive again. Caleb had sent a photo of Eliza holding an award, something academic, something sharp and golden. "So proud of this girl." The message read, underneath it, Emily commented, "She gets it from her father." No one mentioned Nancy, not even Eliza, who normally added at least a quick, "Thanks, Grandma," when she remembered. Nancy stared at the photo for a moment, thumb hovering over the screen. Then she turned it off and placed it face down beside her half-finished crossword puzzle. It wasn't pain she felt, not even disappointment, just recognition, the kind that lands gently, like leaves falling in slow spirals, inevitable. Later that evening, the phone rang. Not Caleb, not Eliza, a different number. Nancy let it go to voicemail, as she often did now, when she finally checked it. The voice was warm, slightly hurried. "Hi, Miss Weller. This is Raina from Asheville Historical Society. I hope this isn't too forward, but we're organizing a community event on intergenerational memory, and we were told you used to teach composition. We'd love to invite you to speak. No pressure." Of course. Nancy played the message twice. No one had asked her to speak in years. She didn't say yes right away. She waited, slept on it, drank her morning tea without writing it down in her planner. But by noon the next day, she found herself replying, "I'd be honored. Thank you for remembering that music matters." The event wasn't extravagant. A folding chair set up in a sunny room at the local civic center. People of all ages, seated in a loose semicircle, their eyes wide and curious. Nancy had brought nothing but a few sheets of music, and her voice, she didn't lecture. She told a story about a girl in her class, decades ago, who had written a lullaby for a baby brother who never came home from the hospital. She spoke not of notes or keys, but of how sound fills the silence when grief doesn't know what else to say. When she finished, the room stayed quiet. Not awkward quiet, listening quiet. And then someone clapped, and someone else followed. After the talk, an older woman approached her. "I lost my sister last year. I haven't touched my piano since," she said, eyes shining. "But I think I might again now. I didn't know anyone else understood." Nancy nodded. "Music is the only way I've ever been able to say the hard things." She returned home with a small bouquet someone had handed her, wrapped in brown paper. It sat in a mason jar on her kitchen table, blooming gently in the window light. 3 days later, Caleb called. Nancy saw his name flash on the screen. She didn't answer. His voicemail, this time, was longer. "Hey, Mom, just wanted to check in. Eliza's been quiet lately. She mentioned you sent her something. I didn't even know you were still in Asheville. We should talk soon. I feel like, I don't know, like maybe I missed something important." Nancy sat still as the message ended. Her tea had gone cold. Outside, the wind rattled a wind chime she'd forgotten she owned. He didn't say sorry. He didn't say thank you. He said, "Maybe I missed something." And for once, Nancy didn't feel the need to fix that for him. The next day, she received a handwritten letter from Eliza. "Grandma, I got your box. I read your note 5 times. I didn't realize how much I'd forgotten to ask you. Can I visit you over fall break? Just me. I want to hear everything." Nancy read the letter under her reading lamp. The words soft but solid on the page. She traced her thumb under Eliza's name, not because she needed anything more from her, but because it had come from love, not guilt. She wrote back the same day. "Yes, sweetheart. I'll be here. Bring an empty notebook and your full heart that weekend." Nancy bought fresh linens for the guest room and finally repaired the squeaky hinge on the hallway door. Not for Caleb, not for show, but for one girl who had listened when no one else did. At the next library visit, she ran into Mariah again, this time with her daughter. Joy, the girl, ran ahead, humming something tuneless but full of spirit. "She's excited," Mariah said. "She's been practicing the finger placements you taught her with forks at the dinner table." Nancy laughed. "Sounds like a born pianist. I don't know how to thank you," Mariah added. "Quieter now. I just didn't expect someone to care this much." Nancy didn't say it's nothing. She didn't wave it off. She smiled and said, "Caring doesn't expire just because someone else stops needing it." To those of you listening right now, have you ever felt like someone only noticed you when you went quiet? When your absence finally echoed louder than your presence ever did? Sometimes that echo is all it takes for someone to realize what they lost. And sometimes we realize we're better off not returning to be found. The first morning of fall arrived in Asheville with a kind of hush. The trees hadn't fully turned yet, but there was a crispness in the air, as if the world had paused to breathe before changing color. Nancy opened her windows, let the chill come through. She wrapped herself in David's old cardigan, the sleeves still too long, and brewed a pot of cinnamon tea. The smell filled the house, not for guests, not for anyone watching, just for herself. She pulled out a notepad and drew a line down the middle of the page. On one side, she wrote, "Used to be for Caleb." On the other, she wrote, "Now for me." She listed without emotion. Grocery money slips she used to save for his favorite snacks. Oil changes she paid for even when he forgot to ask. Birthday cakes she baked with his favorite frosting. Late night drives to get him when he missed the school bus. And across from each of those memories, she added a counterweight. Trying a new soup recipe she'd never made. Booking a train ticket to Savannah. Just because. Buying a new sweater. In a color she used to think was too bright. There was no bitterness in the list. Just math. Quiet. Exacting math. Later that week, she received another envelope, this time not from Eliza, but from Caleb. It was thick, typed, formal. "Dear Mom, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to reach out about your estate plans. Emily and I are trying to get our financial planning in order. And we realized that..." She stopped reading. She didn't tear it up, didn't even crumple it. She folded the letter neatly and slid it back into the envelope, then walked it over to her filing cabinet and tucked it behind a folder labeled "Not Urgent." That same afternoon, she called her attorney and asked for one small change to her trust: to add a secondary letter, to be delivered only in the event Caleb tried to contest the estate after her death. The letter was simple. You asked why. Here's the answer. I gave you everything I have, and when you stopped needing it, you stopped seeing me, and I stopped waiting to be seen. Nancy slept well that night. Eliza called the next morning, breathless with excitement. "Grandma, guess what? I got accepted into a summer fellowship program at the Kennedy Center." Nancy's heart swelled. "That's incredible. Sweetheart, they're offering housing too, so I'll be in D.C. all summer." She paused. "I was thinking maybe we could visit some music museums together before it starts." "I'd love that," Nancy said. "Let's plan it." After they hung up, she went to the bookshelf and took down a map of the East Coast. She hadn't used it since David's last road trip. As she traced a route with her finger, Asheville to D.C., with a few scenic stops, something inside her softened. Not everything she planted had grown bitter. Some roots had found the right soil. At church that Sunday, a woman named Judith approached her after the service. "I hear you're the one teaching Joy Martin piano," she said, eyes twinkling. "I've got a granddaughter who just turned 8. I was wondering if you had room for one more student." Nancy hesitated only a second, then nodded. "Tell her to bring curiosity. I'll handle the rest." She left the church slowly that day, not because she was tired, but because she felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Not grief, not regret, but return. A soft, steady return to herself. On her walk home, she passed by the house with the blue shutters, the one she used to admire when David was alive. A for sale sign had just gone up in the yard. It wasn't extravagant, but it had a wraparound porch and a wide-open kitchen. She paused for a long moment at the gate. She didn't make any decisions right then, but she imagined what it would be like to live there. Host piano recitals in the living room. Serve cider in the fall. Hang Eliza's letters on the fridge, and no one would ever say, "Let's not start a story. Just eat." Because the house would be hers, and her stories would be welcome there. Nancy had never liked brunch crowds. Too much clatter. Too many voices layered on top of each other. None of them listening. But that morning, as she stepped into the Willow Oak Cafe with Eliza, she found herself smiling at the noise, not overwhelmed, just observant. "I saved us the corner table," Eliza said, already pulling her scarf loose. "Figured you'd want to be near the window." Nancy looked at the seat across from her, set with real silverware, a cloth napkin, and a small ceramic vase holding a single wildflower. It was simple, but it was intentional. That mattered more than anyone realized. Their conversation wandered. Eliza talked about her scholarship, her music, her uncertainty about what came next. Nancy listened like she was drinking water. Every word mattered, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was offered. When Eliza excused herself to the restroom, Nancy glanced around the cafe. Across the room, a family was celebrating someone's birthday. Balloons tied to a chair, laughter bouncing off the windows. The mother, gray-haired, smiling, leaned into the group. Her son handed her a forkful of cake with mock ceremony. "For the woman who made me eat spinach for 18 years. Everyone laughed. The woman rolled her eyes and kissed his cheek. Nancy looked away. Not out of envy, not sadness either. It was something closer to remembering. Later, when the check came, Eliza reached for it first. "I've got this." Nancy opened her mouth to protest, then paused and let her do it. "You're growing up," she said, smiling. Eliza smiled back. "I had a good teacher." When they stepped outside, the wind had picked up. Eliza wrapped her arm through Nancy's and asked, "Can we swing by the music store on the way home? I want to show you something I've been working on." Nancy didn't say anything at first, just looked at her granddaughter, eyes full of questions, not answers. "Of course," she said. "Lead the way." That evening, Nancy returned home to a voicemail blinking on her landline. She knew who it was before she played it. "Hey, Mom, it's Caleb again. I heard you were at Willow Oak today." Eliza posted a picture. "Listen, I've been thinking about things. I know I haven't said it right, but maybe we can meet up, just you and me. Talk. I'd really like that." Nancy sat down slowly. The house was dark, but she didn't turn on a light. She listened to the message again, then a third time, and then she deleted it. Not out of spite, not anger. She just didn't owe him that conversation anymore. To those watching, have you ever reached a point where someone offers to talk only after they've seen that you're no longer waiting? That kind of timing, it tells its own story. And sometimes, silence is the only way to let them hear it. The next day, Nancy was invited to speak again, this time at a local middle school's Life Stories event. The students had to write essays based on someone who had lived through decades of change. She was paired with a 13-year-old girl named Lily, who asked questions like, "What was your biggest heartbreak? And do you think people ever actually listen?" Nancy answered them all. Honestly, simply, without performing. When Lily stood on stage to read her final essay, she cleared her throat twice, then looked directly at Nancy in the audience and said, "I didn't know grandmas could be brave. I thought they were just quiet. But now I know sometimes silence is what strength looks like." Nancy didn't cry. She just nodded, hand resting over her heart. She went home that night and lit a candle. No reason, just ambiance. She brewed tea, opened her window a crack, and pulled out the quilt she'd been sewing for months. It had no pattern, just patches of stories. One corner held a piece of Caleb's old baby blanket, another, a strip from the dress she'd worn to David's retirement, and one, small, stitched in navy blue, from the sweater Eliza had once left behind in the car. She wasn't making the quilt for anyone, just for herself, to wrap around her shoulders on nights when even silence needed company. At midnight, she checked her email one last time before bed. There was a message from Emily. "I know things have been distant. I was hoping we could talk about the family trust when you have time. We're making plans for Eliza's college," and thought maybe. Nancy closed the laptop. She didn't respond. She didn't even finish reading the message. Because if there's one thing she'd learned, it's that not every message deserves a reply. Some deserve an empty chair. And in her life now, that was okay. The small house with the blue shutters went off the market the same week Nancy visited it. She didn't mean to buy it. Not exactly. She just wanted to stand on the porch again, feel the wood creak under her step. Imagine what it might be like to hang wind chimes there, the ones still boxed in her closet from a birthday long ago, back when David thought she liked surprises. But the realtor had been kind, quiet-spoken. She'd opened the front door and said, "Take your time," then stepped back without hovering. The house smelled like sun-warmed pine. Its rooms were modest, soft with light, and waiting. Waiting, not for a family, but for a woman who knew what to do with silence. Within a week, Nancy signed the papers. She didn't tell Caleb, didn't tell Emily, didn't ask Eliza either, not because she didn't trust her, but because she wanted this one thing to belong only to her. She moved slowly, box by box, piece by piece. She brought only what mattered. Her piano, her notebooks, a tin of handwritten recipes, and a basket of old sheet music tied in ribbon. Everything else given away. She hired a boy from the neighborhood to paint the back fence and asked Mariah's daughter Joy to help plant wildflowers near the porch steps. When the first daffodil bloomed, Nancy knelt beside it, wiped her hands on her jeans, and smiled. No one had taught her how to plant for herself, but her hands remembered. In the months that followed, she created a rhythm. Mornings started with music, not full performances, but quiet practices. She played Bach on Tuesdays, her own compositions on Thursdays, and on Sundays, she played nothing at all, letting the stillness be its own kind of song. She started hosting a once-a-month gathering, just a few women from town, widows, retired teachers, the woman who sold her jam at the market. They sat on her porch with tea and laughed about things their children wouldn't understand. They called themselves the Wild Table, not because they were wild, but because, for the first time in years, they were allowed to take up space at one. On one of those afternoons, Mariah brought Nancy a small, unmarked envelope. "It's from your granddaughter," she said. "She dropped it off this morning while you were out." Nancy opened it after everyone had gone home. Just one note, written in blue ink. "I played your lullaby in class today. My professor asked who wrote it." I said, "Someone who knew what it was like to love without being thanked." "I love you, Eliza." Nancy sat with that note in her lap for a long time. Then she tucked it into the piano bench. There were no trophies in this new house, no framed certificates, no family portraits. But there were signs of life, a vase of lavender on the windowsill, a tin of cookies cooling beside the stove, a hummingbird that returned every morning to the feeder she'd finally remembered to refill. The past still visited sometimes. Sometimes she still woke thinking she'd forgotten to set the table for someone else. Sometimes her hands reached for her phone when she heard an old song she once played for Caleb. But the urge passed, and with each passing, she grew stronger. She even saw Emily once, at the grocery store, by the produce aisle. Emily was picking over peaches, her face drawn, her eyes tired. Their eyes met. Emily opened her mouth, maybe to speak, maybe just to acknowledge. Nancy gave a small nod. Then she turned and walked toward the tea section without a word. She had nothing left to explain. To those of you watching this, have you ever realized that sometimes the peace we've been chasing isn't found in being understood, but in walking away without needing to be? Because closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's a woman planting wildflowers with her bare hands and never inviting anyone to see them bloom. That spring, Nancy wrote a new piece. She called it "No Applause Necessary." It had no crescendo, no dramatic ending, just a gentle melody that faded into rest. When she played it for joy, the girl asked, "Who's it for?" Nancy smiled. "It's just something I wrote for myself." And for once, that was enough. It was a Sunday when Nancy noticed something strange. The porch chairs, 2 wooden rockers she had restored herself, had shifted slightly, just a few inches, likely the wind, or maybe joy playing with the cushions the day before. But something about it felt symbolic. She moved them back, facing outward again, like 2 people waiting for a sunrise. Then she stepped inside and didn't think about it again. That afternoon, Eliza arrived with a small suitcase and a story in her eyes. "They're trying to make me pick a side," she said, breath catching as she stood in the doorway. Nancy didn't ask who they were. She knew. Caleb and Emily had caught wind that Eliza had been visiting more often, even staying weekends. They didn't like that. Control doesn't survive in ambiguity. "I told them I'm not picking anything," Eliza added. "I just want to spend time with you." Nancy didn't respond with words. She just opened the linen closet and handed her granddaughter a fresh set of sheets. Some declarations don't need ceremony. That night, over lentil soup and soft music, Eliza asked, "Grandma, do you ever miss being part of the big family table?" Nancy stirred her soup. Thoughtful. "No," she said slowly. "I miss the version of me who thought that table had room for everyone." Eliza nodded. "I think I get that now." There was no sadness in the conversation, no anger, just recognition, the softest kind of understanding, the kind that doesn't clamor to be heard. It just settles quietly into place. 2 days later, Nancy received a letter in the mail. It was from the retirement community she had toured almost a year ago, the one Emily had tried to push her into, without ever asking if she wanted to go. The letter read, "We're following up to confirm you never finalized placement. We're holding your name on file, but if you've made other arrangements, no further action is needed." Nancy folded the letter carefully and placed it in the fireplace. She didn't burn it in rage. She burned it because she no longer needed a space made to contain her. She had built her own at the Saturday market. She walked between the stands with purpose. Several vendors called out her name now. She'd become Miss Nancy to the jam lady, to the couple who sold goat cheese, to the boy who bagged produce with careful hands and always gave her the freshest apples. She wasn't someone's mother there. She wasn't mom. She was just Nancy. And it was enough. Sometimes, people from her old life crossed her path. Once, she saw Emily in the bank parking lot, Another time, she heard Caleb's voice behind her at the co-op but didn't turn around. Not out of fear, not to prove anything, but because some door, once closed gently, don't need to be reopened just because someone's knocking. To those listening right now, have you ever realized that being forgotten wasn't the wound? The real wound was being used, then pushed aside the moment you were no longer convenient. That realization doesn't hurt forever, but when it stops hurting, you see clearly. You see who never deserved your sacrifice in the first place. Eliza started leaving small notes around the house. On the bathroom mirror, don't forget how strong you are. Inside the piano bench, you were my first music teacher. Even before I knew it, tucked into the fridge, lentil soup, eel magic. Nancy kept each one. She didn't display them. She folded them gently and tucked them into her journal. Not to prove anything, but to remind herself. Her story had always mattered, even when others had pretended it didn't. The house with the blue shutters didn't feel new anymore. It felt lived in, the way good stories feel after they've been read a few times and underlined in the right places. Nancy stood at the window, holding a cup of warm tea, watching the light move across the porch steps. The wildflowers she'd planted that spring were taller now, brushing against the railing like children leaning into her apron. Joy was playing scales inside, slow, imperfect, but curious. Mariah was sitting in the rocker beside the door, sipping coffee and reading a dog-eared mystery novel. Eliza was upstairs, packing for her train ride to D.C., where a summer of music and possibility waited. No one was rushing, no one was walking on eggshells, and no one was trying to rewrite history. That, in itself, was a kind of miracle. Nancy stepped onto the porch and sat in the chair beside Mariah. The breeze was gentle, but it carried a chill that reminded her fall would return again, and with it, another year, another chance to live on her own terms. "Everything okay?" Mariah asked, not looking up from her book. Nancy nodded, just thinking about how quiet power can be. Mariah smiled. "It's the best kind. You don't have to prove it. You just live it." Later that day, Nancy opened the cedar box that had once held birth certificates, old tax forms, and Caleb's childhood drawings. She'd repurposed it. Inside now were Eliza's notes, the deed to the house, a copy of her will, and a sealed letter addressed, "For Eliza, open only if you need to remember who you are." It didn't name names. It didn't accuse. It just told the truth of a woman who had loved too quietly, been erased too easily, and learned to live loudly in her own quiet way. She placed the box back under her bed, not out of reach, but not in plain view either. The next morning, Eliza came down the stairs with her bags packed and eyes brimming. "I don't want to go," she whispered. Nancy hugged her. "Long and full. That's how you know you were loved well while you were here." Eliza nodded, wiped her eyes, and smiled. "I'll call when I get there." "You always do." And then she was gone. Nancy didn't cry. She went back to the kitchen and made cinnamon toast. Later, she taught Joy how to play the intro to No Applause Necessary. The girl hit every wrong note with passion, and Nancy clapped anyway. The following week, a letter arrived. Caleb again. "Mom, I don't know what I did wrong. I just wish you'd tell me. You disappeared from everything, from birthdays, from holidays, from the trust. I keep thinking about your last birthday. Maybe we should have asked you to tell your story. Maybe I should have listened more." Nancy read it twice, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. No anger, no satisfaction, just peace. Because sometimes the lesson is not about hearing sorry. It's about learning you never needed it to heal. To those of you watching this, have you ever stopped waiting for someone to understand your worth and just started living like they never had the power to define it? Because that's what Nancy did. She didn't write anyone off. She just wrote herself back in. And if you've ever been made to feel invisible, like the room was too small for your story, remember, you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to live like you already matter. Now I want to ask you, have you ever reached a point in life where silence became your form of freedom? Where walking away quietly felt louder than anything you could have said? If this story made you think of someone, or even of yourself, I hope you know your story isn't over. It's just finally yours. Let me know in the comments what part of Nancy's story stayed with you. I'll be reading and I'll be listening.